Hello, and welcome to this Legal Futures webinar, Anti-Money Laundering Update, September 2021. My name is Trevor Hellawell, and I am a solicitor. I apologise for that, but I've spent the bulk of my professional career on the training and development circuit, talking about a wide range of things to a wide range of audiences, but I've been speaking about money laundering primarily since 2003, when the regime first leapt up and bit us. What I want to discuss in this next hour is the financial crimes generally, the broad sweep of things with which we all need to be familiar. And my contention there is that if we are doing our money laundering job properly, then that should equip us to defeat 85 to 90% of the other financial crimes with which we're bedeviled. I also want to say a word or two about terrorism, and obviously as we come up on the 20th anniversary of the 11th of September attacks, terrorism is not far from anybody's minds, of course. But I want then to focus on the anti-money laundering law, which hasn't changed a great deal over the last 20 years, but I just make no excuse for just repeating my contentions about what that law actually requires of us. I'm going, though, to spend the bulk of my time talking about the regulations, which are grafted on top of the law and obviously dictate to us the daily duties under which we have to work. And in the process of that, I'll also be referring to the latest Legal Sector Affinity Group guidance document that was published in January 2021, and also raising a number of other points to watch as we go through. As far as financial crimes generally are concerned, I've mentioned money laundering right at the top of the list because, as I've just said, I feel that if we are doing our money laundering job properly, that will equip us to deal with 90% of the rest of the stuff on this list. But broadly, in a nutshell, the process of money laundering is the process of putting bad money into a good deal. The deals we're doing for clients, perfectly normal, legitimate and above board. The concerns, if we have them, are about the clients and where they get their money from. Mortgage fraud, for those of you working in the property sector, is obviously the converse process. It's putting good money that's come from a legitimate lending source into a bad deal. There's something wrong with the deal, the transaction, or the dealers, the people for whom we're acting. The money is fine, but the people are wrong. But whether it's bad money good deal or good money bad deal, there's a deal in the middle, and as the sentient professionals involved in that deal, we have to have our wits about us, I think is the short point I would make. In no particular order of significance, I list the other factors that I think we need to bear in mind before I look at money laundering in detail. I mention next, and this is perhaps a rather historical reference, but I mentioned next the FinCEN revelations, which hit the fan this time last year, which followed on from the Paradise and Panama Papers leaks of confidential information. The FinCEN leaks were leaks of suspicious activity reports that had been lodged with the American equivalent of our National Crime Agency, the Financial Intelligence Center. The broad message of the idea was that, okay, banks, and it was mainly the banks, had been instructed to move large and probably dubious sums of money around, and they reported it to the financial sector's authorities. The point was that having reported it, they then moved the money. And the journalistic consequence of that fallout from the FinCEN revelations was that, well, you didn't do anything to stop it, did you? You reported it, which is what the law requires, but you then moved the money. So, people achieved what they wanted to achieve. And that, I think, is one of the regrettable criticisms that one could have of the English system too. The terrorism implications, I think, are not lost on us, and I'll come back to them in just a moment if you don't mind, but it's the possibility, and this is what I would suggest we need to be aware of, that seemingly innocuous transactions are being manipulated and the money is going to be put to a terrorist purpose. That's the concern of the terrorism legislation, but I'm just going to spend a moment or two looking at that in a bit more detail in a moment's time. We've also got the sanctions list, and the Treasury is now independently adding people to our own UK lists under the Sanctions and Anti-Money Laundering Act of 2018, which we are now free to do now that we've exited the European Union. There are UN lists of sanctioned organisations and individuals to which we need to have reference as well, but I would suggest that it should be an early part of the checking process that we check whether or not a named client is on the sanctions list, because it would be a criminal offence to have any financial dealings with them without or in breach of a Treasury licence. The Financial Action Task Force, FATF as it's known, publishes a list of uncooperative territories, but we have our own list of high-risk third countries, which I shall refer to as we go through the discussion. Closer to home, we have our own accounts rules, of course, one of the main prohibitions of which in Rule 3.3 is that we must not allow our client account to be used to provide banking facilities to clients. It's a simple prohibition, but we must be legitimately instructed on a legal matter before we hold money for people, and there must be some connection between the legal work we're doing and the monies that we are handling. End of. We also have the Bribery Act, now 10 years old. We also have, well, 11 years old actually. We have the tax evasion provisions of the Criminal Finances Act 2017, both of which regimes require firms to have systems in place to prevent corruption, bribery and tax evasion facilitation offences. And of course there is the whole regime of the cyber criminals, the hacking attacks, the identity frauds and so on, all of which have increased 500% since lockdown began a year past March. And it's in connection with those identity fraud aspects of cybercrime that I just wanted to hover briefly over the implications of Dreamvar and Mishcon de Reya, that property case wherein Mishcon de Reya were acting as the buyer's solicitors on behalf of an innocent buyer of property. Mishcons had undertaken customer due diligence on their own client, the buyer, and they were perfectly happy with his credentials. They'd also checked out the seller's solicitors, validly registered, decent bank account and so on, and they took the seller's assurances that they had conducted customer due diligence on their own client, the seller, as well. It all looked fine, so Mishcons took money from their client, the buyer, handed it over to the seller's solicitors, who then handed it over to the individual seller, who it turns out was a fraudster, and he nicked off to Dubai with the money. Whose fault was that? Mishcon de Reya's was the implication of this decision. And you look at this organogram and you think, well, how can it be their fault? What had they done wrong? What they'd done wrong is they had handed money over into what turned out to be a fraudulent void, and that put them in breach of trust to their own clients. And that's what this case was effectively about. It had little to do with the money laundering aspects of what was going on, particularly on the seller's side. It was everything to do with the fact that the clients trust us with their money. And that's the only thought which I just want to leave with you. Whenever we are in possession of client money, we are under fiduciary duties to protect those funds to the utmost of our ability. And if we end up handing money over into what turns out to be a fraudulent void, we will be in breach of trust, and under the accounts rules, our partners have to make good the shortfall immediately. They might be insured for it, they could possibly sue the seller solicitors on undertakings and all kinds of remedies, but ultimately we must pay our clients back. So the short message, I think, for all of us is we and our accounts teams must be doubly, triply, and I would argue quadruply sure that the person to whom we are sending the money is genuine and legitimate, and we will end up perfecting the transaction as a result of the transfer. I said a few moments ago I wanted to come back to terrorism. I don't want to overdwell on it because I don't think terrorism is that much of a risk, says he cautiously. I'm sure people in the World Trade Center didn't think it was much of a risk that morning either. But it can happen, of course, and under the terrorism legislation there are exactly similar offences to the kinds of offences I'm going to be discussing under the money laundering legislation. There are further offences under the Terrorism Act and the Terrorist Asset Freezing Act, sanctions busting provisions and so on, all of which effectively say that if we, working in our law firm, becomes suspicious that we are supporting terrorist activity, that is a reportable event that we must mention to the money laundering reporting officer. My own differentiation between a terrorism offence and a money laundering offence is that for a money laundering offence to take place, a predicate offence must already have been committed, and we are now handling the proceeds of that crime. Terrorism, no offence need yet have been committed. It's merely our suspicion that the monies that we're handling or the transactions we're doing are going to be put towards supporting a terrorist act. And I mentioned earlier that it's the seemingly innocuous transactions that would worry me. I don't think many of us are going to be flying aircraft into tall buildings, but it's the putting money in an envelope and giving it to your son. You know, it doesn't sound like a terrorist offence. But it is if your son is currently fighting for ISIS in Syria. You're supporting a terrorist activity. Buying a sharp knife from a hardware store doesn't sound like a criminal offence. It's who you stab with it that turns it into one. And hiring a white van from Enterprise Rent-A-Car doesn't sound like a terrorist offence. It's who you drive it at that turns it into one. So seemingly innocuous transactions that are going to be manipulated is the kind of thing that we need to be aware of. But of course, I don't think that's going to happen in the majority of law instances. Rather more likely, and this is the purpose of this webinar, is the implication that we could be involved in money laundering, and there are two chunks of law that I want to deal with. There are the statutory provisions in Part 7 of the Proceeds of Crime Act, which I shall whistle over relatively quickly because there is nothing particularly new in there, before I go on to look at the money laundering regulations of 2017. Which were then amended, as you can see from the different colours in the text on this slide, severally by the Amendment Regulations of 2019, the EU Exit Regulations of 2020, and the High Risk Countries Regulations of 2021. So every year we're getting a new set of regulations grafted on top of what we've already got, and of course we've also got the new draft of the Legal Sector Affinity Group Guidance that was completely revamped and republished in January 2021, which is still, I think, as far as I'm aware, pending approval by the Treasury. But that is our key guidance document. Just as a quick aside, I would say of that guidance document that the LSAG guidance, it's 212 pages long, and I'm sure anybody would be forgiven for not having got to grips with it yet. It is worth a read, but I would be inclined to think if you read nothing else, read the 3 pages that are in Chapter 3, which set out the 36 common compliance principles with which the SRA would have us adhering, to which they'd have us adhering. And there is some tightening of what the regulations provide in 1 or 2 areas. The guidance note suggests that we should be identifying and verifying the identity of the ultimate beneficial owners of corporations. That's a slight difference from what it says in the regulations. They also say that in a manifest oversight on behalf of the regulation drafters, they omitted to mention source of wealth enquiries, and the SRA are now of the view that source of wealth enquiries should be commonplace. We should also be producing evidence of the enquiries that we make, both as to source of wealth and source of funds. And there are some specific training requirements, in particular the provisions on terrorism, to which I've just been referring. Why are all these regulations ganging up on us? Why are we facing this blizzard of bureaucracy, as Paul Philip calls it? Well, I think the reason why they are so agitated about it is because the problem is clearly getting worse. They reckon that whereas 3 years ago we were talking in terms of £40 billion a year sloshing in and out of the UK, they now reckon that the figure is in excess of £100 billion a year. So this has been a tripling, broadly, of the scale of the problem over a 3-year period. And I don't know whether you remember, but in May, I think it was, of last year, 2020, the National Crime Agency were saying we want a tripling of our resources just to keep pace with the scale of the problem. So that is amplifying, of course, and we, as a profession, are reporting a lesser proportion of the matters with which we're dealing. There are perfectly good reasons for that, but we're swimming against the tide of the statistics, shall I say, and that is worrying the authorities, and that's why they're policing us ever more vociferously over recent months. Now, it mentions on this slide that property work is still a key target. It's by no means the only one for the frauds and money laundering incidents, of course, because there are large sums of money that are channeled around on an annual basis. And of course the banking and financial services sectors are enmeshed in this as well, but so are we, obviously. And they reckon that by value, fully an eighth, fully 12.5% of the entire UK landmass has been bought with illegal funds. They reckon 5 billion quid's worth of illegal property purchases took place in a market worth 40 billion. It's an eighth of the total. Now this is by value, and obviously that skews the figures a bit, and we can all think of those super prime properties in London and Cambridge and York and all those other places I've lived and can no longer afford to visit, let alone live there, that are bought through opaque structures and offshore corporations and trusts on behalf of oligarchs, the super rich, and the OCGs. Of course, these transactions are occurring and somebody is doing it. Who? It's not us, but somebody is doing it. And that's what's worrying the authorities. They need to find out who is assisting in these property purchases. Now, I don't know about you, but I was watching Line of Duty for fully 3 episodes of Series 3 before I realised what an OCG was. It's an organised criminal gang, of which there are 4,800 approximately, comprising 140,000 professional baddies, the drug traffickers, the people smugglers, the slave masters, the armed robbers, and so on. And that, of course, is the main target of this legislation. But they're by no means alone, because the legislation also attacks the opportunistic amateur, you and I, who have fiddled something in order to avoid tax. You know, we pay somebody in cash and he doesn't send us an invoice, so we don't have the VAT problem. We don't have to declare it for tax purposes. It's a tax offence of which we are guilty. And that makes us a money launderer every bit as much as if we were a mafia mobster. And that's the difficulty, that we may well be acting for that category of person. Local businesses who, let's face it, have gone through hardship over the last couple of years, hospitality businesses, pubs that have shut down, you know, all that kind of thing. And we act for these people regularly, and we need to be alert to the possibility that they could be crooked, if I can use that phrase. What the Proceeds of Crime Act in Part 7 does is it racks up 3 series of criminal offences, any one of which we could be guilty of committing. They are the principal offences, which carry 14 years in jail. They're contained in sections 327, 328 and 329 of the Act that cover undertaking activities that relate to criminal property. The ancillary offences, which only carry 5 years in jail, the offence of failing to report suspicions of money laundering if you have them, and the tipping off offences, which carry 2 to 5 years in jail, depending upon which provision you're looking at, of tipping off the suspect. Now, we are familiar with these, I know, and I will just quickly take you through each of them. Looking at the principal offences first, the ones that carry 14-year jail term penalties, Section 327 first of all makes it an offence, amongst other things, to transfer criminal property. just moving money around, which of course we do on a daily basis, would be a 14-year jail term criminal offence if the property was criminal property and we didn't do anything about it. Section 329, and I'll come to 328 in a moment, makes it an offence to acquire criminal property or possess criminal property. So receiving funds into client account could be a 14-year jail term criminal offence. Having it in client account could be a 14-year jail term offence, unless for adequate consideration, the section goes on to discuss. So there is a defence for the fees that we are charging because we've given adequate consideration in return for the fees, and that's not a money laundering offence. But the transactional funds that channel through client account are problematic. Section 328, the one in between, makes it an offence to enter into or to become concerned in an arrangement which facilitates the retention, use or control of criminal property by somebody else. Now this section has a number of layers to it, none of which I will go into in great detail, but it talks about us entering into arrangements that facilitate the use of criminal property by somebody else. So what I'm suggesting is that this is the doing of the deal. It's not the handling of the money, but it's the doing of the deal that somehow allows somebody somewhere in the transactional chain to use their criminal property as part of the funding arrangements. The other point I'll make about section 328 is it talks about entering into arrangements, which is obviously exchange, completion, that kind of thing. It also talks about becoming concerned in an arrangement. And at what point do you become concerned in an arrangement? Well, according to Law Society guidance that came out subsequent to the Bowman and Fells case back in 2005, they say that the initial steps in a transaction doesn't necessarily amount to becoming concerned in an arrangement, because there isn't an arrangement to become concerned in yet. But as soon as the client crystallizes their mind and thinks, oh yes, that sounds good to me, there's the arrangement, and any further involvement on our part would be a criminal offence. But, and this was the point of the Bowman and Fells case, the arrangement does not include litigation or other forms of genuine dispute resolution, nor the remission of sums to the client in completion of a judgment or resolution. But, and this is one of the reasons why I say I don't think there's much point in differentiating between the types of work we do, the sums involved remain criminal property. So although we can conduct the litigation for the clients, the sums remain criminal property, and I think that's information which the firm needs against any future re-instruction from the same client. But these sections talk about criminal property, and that's the point I wanted to come back to. What is criminal property? It's defined as the direct or indirect benefit from criminal conduct which we know or suspect to be such. And criminal conduct is any conduct which is an offence in the UK, or which would be if it were committed here. So I just mentioned a few thoughts in italics on the slide here, but random, routine, day-to-day things that, well, particularly commercial clients get up to, are probably criminal offences. You don't have to be convicted of it. You just need to be guilty of the act. You derive a benefit from it, that's criminal property, and you bang to rights. As long as the suspect, we know or suspect the property to be the genesis of illegal activity. And this is a purely subjective test. For the principal offences, the courts will decide what was on your mind at the time you were judging all of these considerations. Knowledge means actual knowledge, but it's over this question of when should we be suspicious that I think there is some debate. Because the courts have said for some years now that speculation is not sufficient to trigger our Proceeds of Crime Act duties. What we need to be suspicious is evidence of illegality. Not necessarily proof, but evidence of illegality. And that becomes a purely personal question about what you thought at the time. If everything appears to you to be absolutely fine, legal and above board about the client, the third party, the transaction, the instructions, the documentation, the source or destination of funds, you are entitled to assume that it is okay. If it looks okay, if it feels okay, if it sounds okay, it probably is. And we can make that assumption. We can assume, apparently, according to the courts of appeal, that the people we act for and the people they deal with are law-abiding citizens who've always done everything the law requires of them, unless and until something tips you off to the contrary. So we can make this assumption, and that, of course, is what we will do in the majority of cases. But, and this is the big but, if there is anything about any of those things which strikes you in any way as being odd or unusual, we have to ask for clarification. We can't just brush it under the carpet and assume it's okay, even though it looks dodgy. No, it looks dodgy, so you have to ask about the dodgy aspects of it. And this is not tipping off, this is just legal advice. You know, we need to be happy in our own water that what we are being asked to do is legal, proper and above board. If not, I'm afraid I'm not going to act for you. So we need to explore what the explanation might be. And of course, there may be any number of explanations, all of which are perfectly acceptable. And if you find the explanations perfectly acceptable, get on with the job. But if there is anything which still nags at you after you've made these inquiries and you can't get to the bottom of it in any satisfactory way, then you have to push the panic button. But whatever you decide, keep an internal record of your thought process. And I say that because of the case of Shah and the HSBC, who say that your suspicions, or lack of them, must be genuinely held. You don't have to be reasonable, you don't even have to be right, but just keep an attendance record of what you thought at 10 o'clock on a Thursday morning against the day where you're asked to justify why you decided what you decided. It doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong, but we just need to know how you were thinking at the time. Now, if you are not satisfied, I say you have to push the panic button, and this is availing yourself of the statutory defences afforded by the Act. And what the Act says is that you must make an authorised disclosure and then get the appropriate consent from the relevant authorities. Now, in short, for most fee earners, the obligation is simply to report the matter to your internal money laundering reporting officer. And if they choose not to report it externally, well, you've done your job because you have made your authorised disclosure to your nominated officer. But broadly, I think the position is that the money laundering reporting officer investigates your concerns, and if he agrees with you that there is good reason for concern, then he will report it externally to the National Crime Agency, because it's only the National Crime Agency that can confer on the firm the necessary consent to doing what would otherwise have been a criminal act. Now, this process of getting consent from the National Crime Agency is referred to as a DAML, a defence against money laundering. And comments in the Shah case would indicate that actually we, within the law firm, are under a positive legal duty to do everything we can to speed up the process of reporting and the getting of a DAML from the National Crime Agency. Because if we are wrong, we could cost the clients fortunes which they cannot sue us for. So we are putting our clients' transactions at risk by having concerns that may well not be well founded. So we need to do everything we can to speed the process up. So we have to tick the right boxes, we have to use the right glossary codes, and critically we have to explain why we are suspicious, the steps that we're going to be taking, and the timelines in order that the National Crime Agency can decide whether or not they're going to give us consent. And this can take time because the Act gives to the National Crime Agency a notice period of 7 working days from the day after the activity report is lodged with them. Now, if they grant permission, obviously we can act from the date of permission. If they decline permission, then clearly the matter is going to be handed over to law enforcement and all bets are off. The problem is that I think in the majority of cases the National Crime Agency just simply ignore the matter. So we have to wait until the 7th full working day expires before we can do anything. And that is ultimately the drawback with this regime. It imports a 10-day deadline for us doing nothing. A 10-day window in which we can do nothing and in which we can say nothing. And that is clearly an awkwardness for us. And I think in many cases, most law firms would just simply, if they got to this point, they would just think, I'm not going to act for these people, and we'll send them away, in which case no report is necessary. Now, on top of that, we've also got the ancillary offences, of which there are 2 primarily, but I'll mention 3, and then I'll come on to the more important regulations. Well, not more important, but practically more important regulations. Section 330 is the main ancillary offence, and it makes it an offence to fail to report as soon as possible that a person has actual knowledge, actual suspicion, or reasonable grounds for suspicion that somebody somewhere is money laundering. They're benefiting from a fiddle, in jocular language. And that information came to you in the course of business in the regulated sector, which most law work is. Now, the point I want to make about the Section 330 ancillary offence is that this is an objective test. And in short, I say that there is no defence for the gullible in relation to Section 330. It's an objective test. Doesn't matter what you thought. It matters what you ought to have thought, what you ought to have realised. So I think there is no defence for the gullible, the inept, the stupid, the young, the old, the busy. If we miss something that we ought to have spotted, we will be guilty of this offence. It's purely objective. It doesn't matter what you thought. It matters what you ought to have thought. And to that end, I would suggest that we have team meetings, regular training exercises, just to keep us at the peak of our vigilance against the possibility that we might miss something. And finally, insofar as I want to go, I'm just going to mention the tipping off offences. I mentioned a couple of moments ago that there's a 10-day window in which we can't do anything for clients, and we can't say anything either for fear of tipping off. Now, the tipping off offences, with a capital T, are offences of making any disclosures, knowing or suspecting that an authorised disclosure has been made, note the past tense, which is likely to prejudice any investigation that might follow. And the information came to us in the course of business in the regulated sector, which most legal work is. 2 points to make about Section 333 and the tipping off offence is that we can only be guilty of capital T tipping off after we report the matter. If we haven't got to that point yet, we can't be tipping off. It's just legal advice, it's just exploratory questioning, it's just ascertaining that everything is okay, and we can continue to proceed. But once we report it, we shut up about it. And I say that because of the other point I wanted to make, that what is punished is not the motivation behind the disclosures you make, it's the effect of it. If the effect of your disclosure is to tip the suspect off, it's likely to prejudice an investigation, and ergo you're guilty of the offence. It doesn't matter that you didn't mean that to be the case. So I think well-meaning members of the teams, whether they be fee-earning teams or support teams, who in good faith answer questions from an estate agent about why we haven't exchanged contracts yet. Oh, there's been some concern about the money, we've reported it to the National Crime Agency, they're going to get back to us tomorrow, so can I give you a ring about lunchtime? You know, perfectly genuine explanation. But it would be tipping off if the agent then said, oh, that's fine, and he goes and tells the suspect. We would be guilty of this offence. So I think the only acceptable way forward is for firms to have a protocol, a form of words that we just simply repeat to anybody who may be enquiring. Though, of course, we owe our clients an explanation at some later stage once the threat of tipping off has abated. So it said in the Shah case. Okay, so that's the general legal framework. I want now to turn to the regulations, because this is obviously where the activity is being conducted, and of course I'm sure most law firms listening to this will be fully aware of this. But I want to discuss the implications of the 2017 regulations, which have been with us for 4 years now. And you look down this list of contents of the 2017 regulations and you think, oh, well, we're already doing all of that, so we'll just carry on. Which I think is what most law firms did, failing to appreciate the subtleties which the new regulations brought in. So we were given a deal of time to get to grips with the regulations, and the SRA were just starting to police us and ask us what we were doing about risk assessments and internal approvals and identification processes and so on, when of course the COVID pandemic hit and regulatory forbearance took to the fore. But now the regulators are coming back. They've sharpened their teeth and they're sinking them into our calves as we are being asked, look, you've had these regulations for 4 years now and still you haven't done a risk assessment. Get a grip, would seem to be their approach. Now, the regulations, as I'm sure you appreciate, catch non-contentious legal transactional work. Doesn't catch the contentious litigation work, but it does catch the actual proceeds of that exercise. But we can conduct litigation and other dispute resolution processes perfectly okay. It catches accountancy and auditing services, it catches banking, financial services, estate agents, letting agents, we're all caught. And it also catches tax advice, assistance and support. And this is a further reason why I suggest that actually I don't think there's any point in differentiating between litigation work, matrimonial work, employment work on the one hand, and corporate work and property work on the other. Because if in the course of conversation with clients on the litigation matters you refer them to accountants for tax advice, that makes you a tax advisor, makes you a tax advisor, even though you are just simply referring them on. So there's all kinds of definitional jiggery-pokery going on here, which catches most of the work that we do. And it talks in the early bits of the regulations about risk assessments, and it says that risk assessments must be carried out at 3 layers. The regulated entities at the bottom, that's you and I, have to undertake our own practice-wide risk assessment. Above us, the regulators have to undertake a risk assessment for their sector, and above them, the Treasury and Home Office have to take a nationalistic view of the risks faced by the UK. Very quickly, I will just point out that the Treasury and Home Office undertook their 3rd risk assessment, which was published in December 2020. And amongst other things, they recognise that we could, in the professional sector, fall into any one of 5 categories. I'm going to dismiss the lower 3 because I don't think that any of us have set ourselves up deliberately to assist drug traffickers in hiding their cash. If you did, I don't think you'd be subscribing to a Legal Futures webinar. But anyway, so we're not complicit, nor, despite the pressures of furlough and the COVID pandemic, I think we may be coerced under financial pressure to taking on things that we'd rather not touch. Most of the evidence would suggest we've done perfectly well, thank you very much. And none of us, I think, would profess to be negligent either, so I'm going to ignore that. But of the remaining 2, the chances are, the Home Office say, we fall into the 2nd category. We may be unwittingly drawn into something which turns out to be irregular, and that is as much our fault as any of the other 3. We ought, as a profession to be asking all of the right questions of all of the right people at all of the right times, and thereby being as vigilant as we can be. And that is really what the Home Office is all the Home Office can hope for. They recognise that we could, of course, be scammed by sophisticated fraudsters. We've got to be up very early to beat them at their own game. So we could, of course, be scammed, but if we are scammed despite our best efforts, that's forgivable, because there but for the grace of God go any of us. But to fail to spot something because we haven't asked the right questions is our unwitting fault, and we will get a kicking for it, I think, is their broad message. And with that in mind, the regulatory bodies, the legal sector affinity group for the legal sector, have undertaken their risk assessment, and the SRA, for their part, are reviewing all firms, and they started this in nearly 2 years ago now, to assess our ongoing compliance with the 2017 regulations. They were asking for our practice-wide risk assessments. They've now moved their focus onto source of wealth and funds queries, which I shall deal with as we go through. But they've found a worrying trend. They've found a third of firms have no risk assessments, have inadequate risk assessments for the matters. They've failed to inquire into source of funds. They've never conducted an audit of their practices, procedures, controls and policies. And 12%, worryingly, an eighth of law firms were referred for serious breaches, and I've just mentioned them on this next slide. I think one of the problems which the SRA are keen to look into is the last point that I mentioned on this slide, the RTFM problem. Read the flaming manual. What you say you do is not what's actually happening. So somebody hasn't read the manual. So read the manual, read your policy, see what you are supposed to be doing and do it. This, I think, is what the SRA are finding as a matter of routine as part of their investigations. So we have to have done, and I'll put it that way, a practice-wide risk assessment. We must afresh view our clients, the countries and jurisdictions where we operate, the products and services, the work patterns and procedures has been a recent inclusion, the transactions we're doing, the delivery channels we're using, the size and nature of the business, and reassess how money launderers could utilize our services to their advantage. Now, of course, work patterns, procedures, delivery channels have undergone a massive revolution over the COVID crisis, and we haven't been meeting clients face to face. Does that give rise to any extra problems? This is the kind of thing which our practice-wide risk assessments must examine. But it's worth just reflecting on what it says in the Legal Sector Affinity Group guidance. In their introductory comments, they say that the better you know your client, the better you understand your instructions, the better placed you will be to assess risks and spot suspicious activities and protect your practice. Fundamental to this, they go on, is an assessment of whether the client's financial circumstances, main business activities, source of funds and source of wealth align with the background and wider profile of the client. But they also go on to say that whilst not ignoring obvious forgeries, you're not expected to be an expert in forged documents, though you might consider circulating some guidance on how to spot obvious forgeries. But the sophisticated fraudsters can still get through. They acknowledge that, and there's no expectation that we have to be forensically capable of spotting them at 1,000 yards. There are some extra implications in the regulations, though I know we've covered this off anyway, but every firm must, where appropriate, they say, appoint a person responsible for adherence to the money laundering regulations of at least management seniority, who must independently screen all the staff and agents, possibly by electronic means, independently audit the policies, and inform the regulator of who the money laundering reporting officer is. I've done other webinars on the distinction between the MLCO, the compliance officer's role, and the MLRO's role for those who are interested. But the other suggestion is that the screening of staff should include a DBS check and on criminal convictions, and possibly a credit check as well on all booms. Who is a boom? Well, it stands for beneficial owners, the owners of the business, the officers, the people who run the business, if there's a distinction between them, and the managers of the business. But managers in this context means those who manage the business beneath the directorial board, but it includes senior leadership teams, heads of department or practice areas, and the money laundering reporting officer. So it digs deeper into the echelons of the structures of the organisation than perhaps we might at once have thought. But my suggestion is that we should be doing this vetting for all staff, no matter how lowly we consider them to be. Then we get on to the main duty, which is that of customer due diligence, and there is no particular change to the rules here, but there is some finesse, I think, behind what we're doing. Rule 27, Regulation 27, requires that firms identify and verify the identity of the client using documents, data, or information from an independent and reliable source, which of course requires that we know who the client is. We also identify any beneficial owners and, on a risk-sensitive basis only, verify that identity, though I'm sure the Legal Sector Affinity Group might take a different view on that. And we have to obtain information on the nature and intended purpose of the business relationship. The further requirements are that this process of identifying and verifying the client is undertaken before we establish relations with the client. It must be completed at least before any final work is done for the client, or we handle any funds for the client. So it must be done right at the outset. Now, the Legal Sector Affinity Group guidance offers some thoughts about how we should be conducting this, and it suggests that for each individual client and matter, we should be identifying the client and verifying the client and the beneficiaries as well, slightly different from what the regulations say. Have an understanding of the source of wealth. Where's that mentioned in the regulations? And funds for each matter. Understand the service you're going to provide. Understand why you are being instructed. Be vigilant to any red flags that might be flying. Decide what you're going to be doing, what evidence you're going to need. Note any ongoing monitoring requirements, and document and record absolutely everything. This is one of the SRA's main bugbears. You say you've done that, but where is the evidence of it? Where is that written down anywhere? It isn't. Fine. Write it down. If in doubt, write it down. If not in doubt, write it down anyway. Write it down seems to be the message. Now, at the same time as all of that is going on, the Legal Sector Affinity Group guidance also suggests that one government document may be perfectly adequate, provided that one government document gives you both a name and an address, or a name and a date of birth. So a passport would do. Name and date of birth. A driving license would do, name and address. But firms may prefer to stick with 2 items of evidence. I make no particular comment, it's entirely your choice. But throughout the COVID pandemic, I was suggesting to law firms that we might have a 3-stage approach. We might obtain copy documents from the clients, and I'd perfectly accept copies sent through the mail. I would then suggest that we have a Skype, FaceTime, Zoom, Adobe, Teams call with the clients live to compare their actual face with the photograph I've got in front of me, and then I would do an electronic search. And I think as the COVID restrictions are released, there's some debate about hybrid working, who's going to be in the office, what days are they going to be there? Do you want the clients to come in and hack through the traffic and find a parking space and bring their documents in, or are you going to stick with something else? and I think in this particular regard, I would suggest that electronic searches are rapidly becoming the default process for identifying things. Now, whether this is a result of COVID or what, I'm not sure, but it may be as a result of a change to the regulations, which say now that online electronic searches are to be regarded as independent and reliable if they are secure from fraud and misuse, and they can provide a level of assurance that the person claiming a particular identity is in fact that person, to a degree necessary to enable you to manage and mitigate your risks. And what I've found is that latterly the electronic search providers have stepped up to the plate, and they are now offering artificial intelligence, biographic technology, cryptographic technology, facial recognition technology, in order to give us that reassurance and to be able to offer us an electronic search product that has some real meat to it. The old search products used to just check various registers and say there is a passport issued to somebody with that name, with that number. Now they will compare the face as well, and can give us a reassurance that the person claiming to be the person of that passport is in fact Fred Bloggs of that address. And increasingly I'm finding that law firms are choosing to adopt the electronic search tool as the default position. And I think that is probably, in my view, the way to go. It's taken me 20 years to be able to get to the point of saying that, but I would be inclined to suggest that just due to the ease of it, it's far quicker to do this. I say this because I had occasion to be acting as guarantor for my son who's taken a lease of a flat in Kingston, and the agents emailed me and said, we need to verify your identity. And I thought, oh God, how are we going to do that then? And they said, go to this website and follow the instructions. So I went to the website and it said, take a selfie. So I took a selfie, uploaded my passport, uploaded copies of my tax returns, bunged it off, and it came back 10 minutes later verified. And I thought, that's so easy. And that, I think, would be the preference, and it's certainly, I think, the preference of the SRA. But obviously I'll leave it entirely up to you. Now, it does say in the Legal Sector Affinity Group guidance that where we are using an electronic tool, we should document why we're using it, the data sources it uses, and in what circumstances we're going to adopt it as our default position. As far as companies are concerned, we must identify and verify the company, name, number, registered office address, the law to which it's subject, the memorandum by which it's governed, and the names of the members of the boards or senior management teams. But we also have to identify, and if you take the Legal Sector Affinity Group view, verify the beneficial owners who own the business. We know the business, we know who runs it, but who owns it. And in theory, we should be identifying the controllers of more than 25% of the shares in the business. But what if there are 4 people who only have 25% of the shares each? They don't hold more than 25% of the shares, so they're not significant shareholders. But if anyone exercises control over management, then they are significant shareholders, not by dint of the share size, but by dint of their control over management. And we need to understand that. The strictures in the regulations are that we must now take reasonable measures to understand the ownership and control structures of the organisation. Now, LSAG suggests that we might use electronic tools to verify the identity of these beneficial owners. I leave it to you to decide. But what I think we need to be careful of is that we do not rely on Companies House data. It's okay to request Companies House data, but it's not sufficient in itself to satisfy our CDD duties. We have to check the information with the corporations to ensure that what we think the position to be is in fact what the position truly is. And of course we're now under a duty, though this has got little to do with money laundering and everything to do with corporate administration, to report to the registrar of companies any discrepancies between the data which we have got from a company's house search and the true position. Now, there are ways in which we can report this, and as you can see, 3,000 reports, more than 3,000 reports were made to the end of 2020, the first year we had this obligation. So there's clearly an irregularity between what's on the company's house registers and the true reality of the position, and we need to report that point to them. We're not yet finished, because we must identify and verify the identity of the person instructing the firm if we have not already done so. This is an agency point as well as it is a money laundering regulations point. But unless somebody has valid agency to represent the corporation, we shouldn't be taking them on anyway. Now, I disagree with the LSAG comment, which I also include on this slide, which says that employees of your client may be regarded as having ostensible authority to instruct you. I don't think they do have ostensible authority under agency law. This is the Legal Sector Affinity Group's guidance view, but I don't think they do have ostensible authority. Just being employed by Greggs plc doesn't entitle you to instruct people to do things on behalf of the corporation. Where I do agree is that where it's not clear what their authority is, CDD should not be considered as complete, which doesn't add anything to what I've been saying for many a long year. We need to check the authority which people purporting to represent companies claim to have. There are rules about beneficial owners of trusts, which are mentioned on the slide here. Broadly, we have to identify absolutely everybody. Gone is the suggestion that we only have to trouble ourselves with beneficiaries that have a 25% or more, well, a more than 25% claim on the fund. Yeah, gone. And if ever we're acting on behalf of an estate, the rules are pretty much as they always have been. We have to understand who the executors and administrators are, and ultimately, before we pay them, obviously we need to check the identity of any beneficiaries as well. So that's the mechanics of the kind of information we have to gather in. But I think we're very good at getting the documentation. I think we may be less good at vetting the documentation. And that's where I just wanted to hover briefly, because I think it is part of the CDD process that we check the documentation produced to ensure that it does in fact identify the client. We need to be checking the photos. Do they look like the client? Checking addresses, checking dates of birth, checking the information, the timings. Does it all fit together? And if not, we question any irregularities. Likewise, we have to check the corporate information if we're acting for a corporation. The other thing that we need to do, and this is why I'm just slowing down slightly, is we need to be checking not only the source of funds, but also the source of wealth as well. Now this is a sensitive area of questioning because, okay, we have to ask about source of funds. Who's paying for this? Is it a mortgage? Where's it coming from? And are you getting any deposits from your bank of your mum and dad and all that kind of stuff? And we assemble that information as far as this transaction is concerned. That's true. But where we have to probe more sensitively is in source of wealth inquiries. Where do you get your money from? Where have you got your money from? What kind of job have you done? Have you had legacies from wealthy relatives? Where do your kids go to school? Have you got properties in France? It's a general conversation just to get a feel for the financial wherewithal of the client, which is an embarrassing set of questions for support staff to ask, and I'm not suggesting that they should. But we need, as fee earners, to understand the client's sources of wealth. You're a plumber and you drive a Bentley. Surely that can't be right. Well, wrong example, but you know what I mean. We have to be asking these questions. Now, it's not required by the regulations anywhere. Well, it is in one limited place, but this is generally what the SRA are expecting us to ask about. And I've created a template. I'm sorry you can't read it, the print's too small, but there is a template there that one could use for recording this information. And I think one of the things I find as part of the audit process that I undertake for some certain clients is that we know this information, but it's not written down anywhere. And that's what the SRA are looking for. If we wanted a justification, we could mention the unexplained wealth order, which is an order that law enforcement agencies can use to extract this information. And there have been 5 unexplained wealth orders used so far, the first, of course, being used against Zamira Hajieva, the wife of the Azerbaijani banker who was currently in jail on fraud charges. Now, she was the woman who spent 16 million quid in Harrods in the run-up to one Christmas, and you think, what on earth do you find 16 million quid to spend in a shop? Anyway, she wasn't able to answer their questions and has had her Surrey estate and private golf course forfeited. So if they can ask these questions, I think so can we. Now, that is the standard approach to CDD. Sorry it's been a bit of a romp through, but I'm obviously slightly limited on time. But there are, I think, also a few things I wanted to mention, and one critical point in particular. We have the standard approach for the middle of the bell curve, but there are extremities at either end. There are some clients for whom we could get away with doing simplified CDD, making lesser enquiries, listed PLCs, public authorities, FCA authorised banks, that kind of client. But at the other end, there are clients for whom we have to undertake enhanced CDD, asking more questions than might be required of us. And this is where our practice-wide risk assessment has to do the heavy lifting. Because our risk assessments should be listing those for whom we're going to use enhanced CDD and what enhanced CDD looks like for each of them. This is the list of when the regulations suggest we should be encompassing enhanced processes, where the client or counterparty is established in a high-risk third country. If the client is a PEP, they've provided false identity information, there are unusual features to the transaction, or there are any circumstances where the nature of the situation is such that we feel there are higher risks involved. It's up to us to make those decisions now. I've just mentioned on this next slide the updated list of high-risk third countries, and I'll just simply ask the question on this next slide. You'll notice if you looked at that list, I didn't give you a chance to do so, but if you'd looked at the list, Russia's not on there, China's not on there, Iraq's not on there, Azerbaijan's not on there, and of course latterly Afghanistan is not on there. So what do we do about those jurisdictions? But the key point I wanted to mention is over the PEP issue, which I think is probably becoming slightly more problematic because the PEP regulations have included UK-based individuals who in the definition. That's one reason why it's a problem. The other reason it may be a problem is because we may be doing electronic searches more commonly, and they will flag up false positives. But PEPs, and I'm sure you don't need me to go through the definition, are any individuals who've been heads of state and high-ranking officials in the armed forces and people of that nature, but it also includes their family and their business associates. And for many a long year I've been saying, how would you know that you're acting for a PEP unless you ask? You know, you could ask them a question on a standard form, or you could do an electronic search, and the electronic searches are now becoming increasingly common. But if they throw up the idea that Marcus Cox that you're doing a search against may be the son of the MP for Torridge and West Devon, they're a PEP if they are the son of the Torridge and West Devon MP. But this is what I mean by false positives. We need to weed those false positives out. No, it's a different Marcus Cox. If it is the Marcus Cox who is the son of the MP for Torridge and West Devon, then there are certain requirements that we have to go through. We have to get approval from senior management, we have to get source of wealth and source of funds enquiries made, and this is the only place the regulations do mention source of wealth enquiries, and we have to undertake enhanced ongoing monitoring. There are provisions in relation to reliance. We could rely on the activities of others in the doing of our CDD, but there's no appetite for that across the profession. So I wanted to move on to this next point, which I regard as the more critical. Having dealt with, in the time I've had, the process of customer due diligence, going through it in some detail, of course that is an important part of the process. But it's not the only part of the process. The other part is that of ongoing monitoring, and I feel that this is the most critically important part of the whole shebang. It's not, in linear terms, the most voluminous by any stretch of the imagination. It's just 3 lines of text in Regulation 2811. But there are 2 bits to ongoing monitoring. The first is that we must keep our CDD information up to date. So this doesn't mean redoing the CDD information every time, but it does mean that every time we're re-instructed, we ask the clients to confirm that the details that we have on file are still accurate. I think that's about as far as it need go. It's the second part. That what I think becomes critical is not so much who the client says he is, because anybody can get through those processes with forged documentation, fake documentation, cloned documentation. It's this part. That whatever the client has told us is one thing, but we must then undertake a scrutiny of the matters conducted throughout the relationship to ensure consistency between what we are now instructed to do and what we think we know of the client, his business and risk profile. And this is the bit which I think becomes critical to good money laundering practice. We always have to remain vigilant to the possibility that somebody has instructed us historically on a series of matters, all perfectly genuine, and then when they think they've lulled us into a false sense of security, they'll shaft us with something dubious. Not if we're undertaking our ongoing monitoring duties properly. We used to call it KYC, know your client, call it what you will, but it becomes a critical exercise of individual discretion. No matter what your systems do, no matter what buttons you press, no matter what searches you get in, we have to ask ourselves, is what we're being asked to do consistent with what we know of the client? If it is, get on with the job. If it isn't, report it. Now, time's against me in dealing with records in any detail. I'll just simply point out that we obviously have to keep records of absolutely everything. And of course, training is something that we must also regularly participate in, as of course I'm sure you well know. The conclusions, though, that I would draw on this are, as I've just said, we need to be and remain consistently vigilant to the possibility of criminal activity occurring. We said right at the start of this hour and a bit that we have a range of things to think about, and we need to be on our guard at all times to anything that is being done which is criminal. We have to ask all and any sensible questions, recording the responses where possible, and report it if we're not happy. Customer due diligence, ongoing monitoring, the whole money laundering thinking has to be a culture from which we never switch off, we never take our eyes off the ball. It's not an event, it's not something that we do to a client at the start of a matter and then forget about it. Far from it. It has to be a culture. Thank you very much indeed for listening.